Today I'm going to be watching this video. It's called Everything I Found Out Living in Australia for 3 months. So I believe this guy is from America, going from the thumbnail. One of my viewers asked me if I would check it out. So interested to see what he thinks about living in Australia. Always like to see this, see the interesting points and observations that people bring up. Tell me what you think as always.
It has been 3 months since I arrived here in Australia from the US, and over this time period, I feel that I've discovered quite a few things that I wouldn't have known about while researching Australia. So in this video, I just want to share some of the more interesting or useful things I've discovered while living here. And hopefully if you're thinking about coming to Australia, that can help you as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is going to the pharmacy, or the chemist as you would call it here. If you use any sort of over-the-counter medications consistently, I would definitely look into what is available in Australia before coming here. I know in my case that I often will use melatonin when I'm traveling, as I have trouble sleeping in hostels and stuff like that. And when I arrived here, I found out that you actually have to have a prescription or be over 65 in order to get melatonin from the pharmacy. And in Australia in general, there's a lot more regulations on different drugs that you can get from the pharmacy, especially over-the-counter ones. So I would definitely recommend stocking up on whatever it is that you might need before coming here. Another example of this is I remember I got really sunburnt and I wanted to get some ibuprofen, and I had to go up to the counter and ask for permission before I could actually get the ibuprofen. I was still able to get it, but it's just very different from my experience, especially back in the States.
Yeah, I didn't know that you would need to get permission for ibuprofen, but I guess in general it's a good thing that there's more regulations, of course, and it's harder just to get any sort of medication. From what I've learned about the USA, that they just try and shove medication down everybody's throats. It's highly advertised on TVs, very accessible, and yeah, I think making it a bit more restrictive is better in the sense that people won't just take it whenever they can. They won't get addicted as easy and stuff like that. Tell me what your experience with that is.
The second thing I want to talk about is shopping in Australia. So if you're going to the grocery store, typically if you're just going to a bigger store, you have two choices, and it's either going to be Woolworths or Woolies or Coles. One of the first things I noticed when shopping here in Australia, which definitely might be just the US background rubbing off on me, is that stores are a lot more specialized and separated, whereas back home, in my experience, if you go to a Walmart or a Target or something like that, you're going to find almost anything you would need on your shopping trip all in one place. Whereas here, you're going to have to go probably to multiple different stores in order to pick up everything on your shopping trip. An example of this is you'd have to go to Woolies to go get your groceries, and then if you wanted to go get some sort of alcohol, you'd have to go to the bottle shop. If you wanted to get some sort of tobacco or something, you'd have to go to the tobacconist. Another thing about shopping here in Australia is self-checkout is really big here, and almost everyone will opt for self-checkout. Sometimes you do see cashiers still manning the kind of conveyor belt system checkout thing as well, but for the most part, everyone uses self-checkout. One last thing about shopping in Australia, I would say that most people say cost of living here is pretty expensive. I'd say as far as groceries go, it's not too different from other countries that I've been to, especially when you compare it to what minimum wage is here and what just kind of normal pay is here in general. The third thing I want to talk about is eating out here in Oz, and I would say that when you're going to a restaurant here, self-service again is a lot more prevalent here than other places that I've been to. Here it's a lot more typical to go up to the counter, order your food, and then once the food's ready, also go up and pick it up yourself, instead of having a server or a waiter bring the food to you. Another thing about eating out in Australia is tipping's not a normal thing. Sometimes people still do tip, but it's a lot more rare and it's not expected if you are going out to eat. Number 4 is alcohol and drinking culture here. So alcohol will typically probably be a little bit more expensive than what most people are used to if you're visiting here as a foreigner. That being said, I find it pretty funny as drinking culture is pretty big here in Australia, and that does not stop Aussies in the slightest. If you're going to a bar here, people typically order schooners, which is a slightly smaller size glass than a pint, even though they do have pints here as well. One useful thing to know here is when you're going out for drinks in Australia, bars will have a taxi call system. You can go up to the bartender and just say that you need a taxi called, and they will have a taxi come to get you in case you've drank too much.
I've never seen that before, actually.
You're in a bad state. Number 5
have you ever
is
used that?
Gambling culture here. So I was pretty shocked to find out that gambling is pretty big here, and every other pub or town.
I mean, to a betting game played on Anzac Day. Tell me how this works. That's definitely not something I've seen before. With regards to gambling, I've seen it, like, surprisingly, I think Australia was one of the highest gambling countries in the world. I never actually knew that, but tell me more about this one. That looks quite fun as well.
Tavern you go to will have some sort of gambling included in the venue. Typically, this ends up coming in 3 forms that I've commonly seen. There's TAB, which is either sports betting or betting on races like horse racing or dog racing. Then there is Keno, which is almost equivalent to like a digital bingo type thing, where you get a ticket and then you see if you get the numbers that are winning or losing. And then third, there's what they call pokies, which essentially are slot machines. And usually a pub here will have its own dedicated section just to pokies, where people will sit and play the slots.
Yeah, that one as well. Yeah, I didn't realise the first 2 were so prevalent as well. I just recently went back to Scotland and I seen those machines. In Scotland we call them puggies, like those gambling machines that are in restaurants and pubs and things like that. So I hadn't actually seen them for quite a few years. Hadn't seen these new ones as well with the lights around them and so on. But what do you think about gambling in Australia? Do you think it's like a problem? Think it's too much? Is there a lot of gambling advertisements and things like that? Do you think people should be gambling less? What's your opinion on it?
6 is work culture here. So this is one of the things that I was most interested in coming to Australia for, as I'd heard that work-life balance here is really good. And after being here for 3 months, I can definitely confirm that is the case. Here in Australia, I think there's a lot less pressure to go down the typical 9-to-5 career path, and people in general are a lot more accepting and open to different career paths. So if you want to become a tradie, if you want to work in hospitality, people aren't going to place as much judgment on you if you go an alternate route from the more traditional 9-to-5 career path. If you're working here in Aus full time, it's typical to see most people get 5 weeks of paid vacation, which is very different from what I'm used to back in the States, with it being more typical to see 2 weeks. And people will actually take their vacation time, which is not often the case back in the States as well. People are typically a little bit more hesitant to take time off from work. Whereas here, people aren't afraid to take their vacation time and take advantage of the time they have off. In what I've seen so far, the workplace generally tends to be a little bit more relaxed as well. People are more willing to joke around and have a bit of fun while working, and it's just not quite as serious as some other places that I've lived. Number 7 is interacting with Aussies, and the first thing I noticed as a foreigner coming here is Aussies love to chat, and they're very willing to talk to strangers. When speaking with Aussies, you'll notice that they're very straight to the point and they're not afraid to speak their mind. A good example of this is, since I've been walking around in a brace after my injury, people often come up to me, and I've gotten the question multiple times, very straightforward, where someone will just ask, "What's wrong with the leg?" or "What did you do to yourself?" And typically, I think in a lot of other countries, people would either kind of dance around that or they would just avoid asking in general. But here, people just aren't afraid to ask if they're curious, which is pretty cool. But I will say that if you're a foreigner, sometimes it could be maybe a bit disarming Generally, it's not people being rude here in Australia, that's just kind of how things are. Number 8 is the wildlife here, and I would say if you're worried about running into dangerous wildlife, don't be, as long as you're living in a city. That being said, I've never lived out in the bush, so I can't say what it's like out there. But at least for me, I haven't had any super crazy encounters with wildlife out here.
What is that? Look at how big that thing is, bro.
Gee. I've seen the photographs of those things, man, and they're just ridiculous inside.
Why do they always post up right here?
What is this? I ain't never seen something like this before.
The roach, dude. Whoa.
Just floating right above
This
where I do
guy's
the dishes.
House,
Go away.
man.
That being said,
There's a lot of
there's
things. How
two
do you get rid of
exceptions
all
to this
of
that I
them?
think most people experience. And number 1 is the birds here. Everywhere you go, at least everywhere I've been in Australia, there are a lot of crazy and very noisy birds.
Yo, thing is huge. What the hell is that? That's a big one. You can barely see him. One over here too. Oh yeah.
At this point, I just find it pretty entertaining, but I remember when I first got here, it actually would keep me up at night because the birds are very vocal here. Number 2 is if you're going to the beach, and especially here in North Queensland where you're next to the reef, they do get a lot of what they call box jellyfish, which are quite dangerous. So a lot of the times it's very common to see at a public beach that there'll be a enclosed net area, and that's mostly to keep jellyfish out. I've heard people say it's to keep sharks out. I don't know if that's really true, but I know it's definitely for the jellyfish. So just keep that in mind as well. And number 9 is if a word or a sentence can be shortened, Australians will shorten it. Sometimes though, it will cause a little bit of an interesting miscommunication. I remember when I started working at a bar here, everyone would always refer to everything in acronyms. So Jack Daniels is JD, Jim Beam is JB, Canadian Club is just Club. And so it would get quite confusing at first. You'll get used to it, but you may have a little bit of a learning curve there. Additionally, a lot of words will just get shortened and have an O added at the end. So registration will be rego, service station will be servo, utility vehicle is a U, and you get the point. Anyways though, yeah, that's most of the interesting things that I've noticed the past 3 months living here.
Yes, tell me what you think about them. Interesting things again, like again, some of those things, yeah, I've heard before, but like his house is absolutely infested, man. That actually freaks me out a bit, seeing all those ants and like there's something everywhere in his house. Is that normal? Do you have that many things going on in your house? Can you just get rid of things like that, like all the like cockroach, the fly, everything, man? He seemed to attract a lot of things in his house. And the birds, like if you live in the suburbs somewhere in Australia, outside an Australian city, do you always hear birds? Like I love to sleep, and if I was to move to Australia, like I really like cannot handle not getting enough sleep. So if a bird was keeping me up, that would be a problem. But like where you live, do you hear birds? Is it an issue? Tell me what you think about these as always. Thanks.